Hey, it's Brewbird. I'm a Canadian distiller. If you're interested in learning about distilling, brewing, or more about the drinks industry, then this is the channel for you. In this video, I'll be answering some of the most frequently asked questions about gin distillation. So let's get to it! Should I macerate my botanicals in spirit? I've worked at gin distilleries where they macerate their botanicals in spirit overnight before starting the distillation. And I've also worked at distilleries where they don't macerate at all. So they charge the still with the botanicals, the spirit, and the water, and they start the distillation immediately. People who argue for macerating the botanicals say that it extracts more flavors from the botanicals, whereas people against macerating the botanicals says that it extracts unwanted flavors from the botanicals. It all depends on what botanicals you're using and what flavor profile you're looking for. There really is no right or wrong answer here, as you can make a good gin by macerating and not macerating your botanicals. So it's really up to you, and you can experiment to see what you like best. If I decide to macerate my botanicals, how long should I do this for? If you decide to macerate your botanicals, then most gin distilleries will macerate for anywhere between 12 to 24 hours. So they'll charge the still the night before, let the botanicals macerate overnight, and start the distillation the next day. Macerating for 36 hours to 48 hours is pretty common as well. After 48 hours, it's generally considered that most of the flavors have been extracted from the botanicals, and it isn't worth it to continue macerating the botanicals. Although I have heard of distilleries that macerate their botanicals for up to 1 week. An important thing to keep in mind if you're distilling commercially is that if you decide to macerate your botanicals, then you're also increasing the production time of your gins. Since it takes longer for your gin to be ready for sale for customers, this can cause logistical and production scheduling problems. And you might miss out on gin sales since it's taking so long to produce your gins. However, this isn't a worry if you're a home distiller. You can macerate for as long as you want to. If I decide to macerate my botanicals in the spirit, what temperature should the spirit be? Whenever I've macerated the botanicals, I've always done so in room temperature liquid. I've heard of distilleries that heat up the liquid that they macerate their botanicals in. And the idea is, if the liquid is warmer, then it will be faster to extract the flavor compounds from the botanicals. However, if the liquid is too warm, then you risk cooking the botanicals and changing the flavors that are extracted from them. As well, the cooked botanicals can caramelize to the interior of the still and produce burnt, caramelized flavors that are undesirable in your gin. What should the percentage of the alcohol be that I charge my still with for the distillation? Usually, people will charge the still with spirit that's around 40 to 60% ABV for a gin distillation. And most of the distilleries I've worked at, it's been 40% ABV. Some flavor compounds in the botanicals are more ethanol soluble, and others are more water soluble. So if you want to target the more ethanol soluble flavor compounds, then you would charge the still with a higher strength spirit, closer to 60%. Conversely, if you want to target the more water soluble flavor compounds in the botanicals, then you can charge the still with a lower ABV spirit, closer to 40% or even lower. You don't want to charge the still with too high a percentage of spirit, like 80%, as that will mean the distillation will be very short, since there's more ethanol in the mixture, and ethanol has a lower boiling point than water. A shorter distillation will mean that you have not extracted as much of the flavor compounds from the botanicals as you may have liked. Should I crush my botanicals to get more surface area from them? Or should I just leave them whole? To crush or not to crush? By crushing the botanicals, you're increasing their surface area so that you can extract more flavors from the botanicals. In commercial distilleries, the botanicals are often left uncrushed because crushing the botanicals just adds to the production time of the gin. So it's easier to simply increase the botanical load rather than to crush them up. Some people will also argue that by crushing the botanicals versus leaving them uncrushed, you're changing the flavor profile of the gin. Again, there is no right or wrong answer here. You can experiment with crushing the botanicals and not crushing them and seeing what you like best.
How do I go about making a gin recipe and selecting my botanicals?
Good question. I've already made a video about how to make and distill your very own gin recipe, and I've included that link above, so please check it out.
Why do you take a heads cut in your gin distillation if you're charging the still with neutral grain spirit? Shouldn't neutral grain spirit be flavourless and free from methanol?
Chances are you're using your still to distill multiple gin recipes and other types of spirits. We take a heads cut not necessarily to remove any flavor compounds or congeners from the neutral grain spirit. Instead, we use the first fraction of distillate that we collect to rinse out any unwanted bitter compounds from the condenser piping in the still. As these unwanted bitter compounds are residues left over from the tails of the previous gin distillation and are undesirable in the quality gin that we're trying to produce. Additionally, methanol is notoriously difficult to separate out from ethanol. So if you're using 96% neutral grain spirit, then chances are it will contain trace amounts of methanol in it. However, it's highly unlikely that these trace amounts of methanol will cause you bodily harm if ingested. And I've worked at gin distilleries where they didn't even bother to take a heads cut. However, it's always better to be safe than sorry.
Should I distill all my botanicals separately and then blend the distillates together to create a gin? Or should I just distill all my botanicals together? Which is better?
There are some gins that are made by distilling each botanical separately. And then these distillates are blended together afterwards to produce the final gin. This is a perfectly valid way of making gin. Keep in mind that distilling each botanical separately and then blending the distillates together will produce a slightly different gin than if you were to distill all the botanicals together. However, this method gives you more control over the production of your gin and allows for more recipe experimentation. The downside of this method is that it's more time consuming since you have to do so many more distillations. As well, it requires more containers to store all the distillates, and it requires more time, energy, and money to run all the distillations.
Which botanicals are better vapor infused and which are better being distilled directly in the liquid?
Again, there's no right or wrong answer here. It all depends on your gin recipe and what you're looking for flavor-wise. You may find that you prefer to have a portion of your botanicals vapor infused and have the rest of the botanicals in the pot distilled in the liquid. Or you may want to keep things simple for yourself and have all the botanicals either vapor infused or distilled directly in the pot. It tends to be that herbs like rosemary and thyme or flowers like rose petals and lavender are better vapor infused so that they don't dominate the flavor of the gin.
I've heard that I need to add either orris root or angelica root to my gin recipe since they act as fixatives. Is this true?
Orris root and angelica root are widely regarded as fixatives in a gin. That means they equalize the vapor pressure of volatile compounds in a gin. In simpler terms, this means they aid in keeping the gin aromas to the liquid medium, or they fix the flavors in place so that the gin flavor and aroma remains the same even after a long period of time has passed. These two botanicals are widely used in the perfume industry for this reason, although there's a lot of debate as to whether they actually are fixatives. You'll find that they're common ingredients in gin recipes, but if you're using them for their fixative properties, then it's important to remember that these ingredients have flavors of their own. Orris root has a woodsy and floral aroma, whereas angelica root has woody, earthy, and herbal aromas.
The gin I distilled is cloudy and murky looking. Why is that?
That's known as gin lushing or the ouzo effect. Botanicals have oils in them which are collected in the distillate. If the oils are especially big or heavy, then they can come out of solution and this will result in a cloudy looking gin. If you want to learn more about how to prevent gin lushing, then I've made a video about it which I've linked above and you can check that out.
The gin I distilled has a green tinge to it. What is that?
If you've got a copper still, then when the copper oxidizes through water contact, it can turn the copper a blue-green color. Sometimes this will result in a bluish-green tinged distillate. This is toxic verdigris and is poisonous if ingested, so be sure to clean your copper with a caustic cleaner.
Is a copper still or a metal still better for distilling gin?
Well, if you're using 96% neutral grain spirit, then it really doesn't matter too much whether you're using a copper or metal still, as the botanicals will dominate the flavor profile of the gin. However, if you're making the base spirit yourself, that means you're taking a raw material, such as malts, and you're mashing it, fermenting it, and distilling it to create a base spirit, which you'll then use to do your gin distillation with. Then copper is preferred as it helps to remove sulfurous compounds in the distillate. As well, if you're macerating your botanicals, the still type can have an effect. If the oils sit too long in a copper still, this has the potential to cause issues later on.
If a gin distillery makes their own base spirit, is the gin they produce better than a distillery that buys in neutral grain spirit?
Ooh, controversial question. The majority of gin distilleries purchase in 96% neutral grain spirit to do their gin distillations with. They argue that the flavor of the gin comes from the botanicals and not from the base spirit that's being charged into the still. Other gin distilleries who bring in a raw material such as malts and mash it, ferment it, and distill it to create their gins will obviously take great pride in the fact that, unlike the majority of their competitors, they are making their own base spirit. As well, they will argue that the base material they use to create the alcohol, whether it's grape skins, malts, or wheat, is important and does impact the final flavor of a gin. Producing your own base spirit requires much more time, money, energy, and effort than simply purchasing in neutral grain spirit. I think it's important to recognize that this is a more time and money consuming process, and that should be reflected in the price of the gin.
Which is a better method of distilling gin? Multi-shot distillation or single-shot distillation?
A multi-shot distillation is where a gin concentrate is produced by increasing the botanical load by 2-fold or even 200-fold. Then, neutral grain spirit and water are added to the concentrate to bring it to the desired percent ABV and volume. So you can collect 20 liters of distillate and produce 200 liters of gin using this method. For single-shot distillation, you put in the normal amount of botanicals, collect the distillate, and then add water to the distillate to bring it to the desired percent ABV. So if you collect 20 liters of distillate, you'll probably end up with around 40 liters of gin in the end. As you can see, the multi-shot process is more time, money, and energy efficient. Some people argue that this is a very lazy way of making gin and that it produces an inferior gin to the single-shot method. Others have said that in a blind taste test, they couldn't tell the difference between gin samples that were made using the multi-shot process compared to the single-shot process. I'll leave it up to you to decide which method is better, if there even is one. I hope this video answered some of your burning gin distillation questions. In the meantime, please help this channel grow by giving this video a thumbs up and leave a comment down below. Please hit the subscribe button for more distilling, brewing, and nerdy drink videos. This is Brewbird, sending good vibes your way. I'll see you next time.